So then with that bodhicitta motivation, we can just do the verse of refuge from bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. So just remind everybody we're on right, we're still on the sutra school of the Sautrantikas, and we're on the fifth of the 7 points, which is the way of asserting object possessors, which means subjects, right, or knowers, I guess you could say, right, cognizers. And for those who are following in text, we're on page 12, where it talks about there are 5 types of non-valid cognizers. And I'll just mention something, which we'll talk about various, but so here it lists 5, right? And I want to point out that sometimes when you study, I guess, awareness and knowers, or mind and cognition, or whatever, like they talk about 7 ways of knowing according to this tenet system. So that would be these 5 plus the 2 types of valid cognition we already mentioned, right? So remember there was on the previous pages, it talks about how, on page 10, it talks about how there are direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers, right? So there are 2 types of valid cognizers and 5 types of non-valid cognizers, which makes a total of 7 ways of knowing according to this tenet system. And what I'm going to do, actually, we're going to go through these 5, but I want to cover the first, subsequent cognizers, because that's straightforward. And then I'm going to pause and sort of bring up something I mentioned at the end last time and just talk about it a little bit, which is after subsequent cognizers comes a kind of, I think, a very useful, all of these are useful in the sense of understanding, all of these are useful in the sense that, these aren't describing something distant from you, right? The idea here is this is how you know. Does that make sense? This is like saying, how do you know anything? How do you cognize things? How do you perceive? How do you know anything? And this is describing these are the ways you and I and sentient beings cognize. So this is actually, I want to point that out. None of these are like some kind of distant academic subject, but they are describing. They're tools for looking at your own experience or for introspection, if that makes sense. So like by understanding these, then you can look at your own mind and check how is my mind function? How do I interact with external objects and internal thoughts? Right? So anyway, that's that. But I want to cover subsequent. So I'm going to start with, and we'll do them in the order that they present. So we'll start with subsequent cognizers, and then I'll pause and say something about the next group. But so for each one here, it's going to give the definition according to Justin Choki Gelton, right, the author. So he says the definition of a subsequent cognizer is a knower realizing that which has already been realized. There are 2 types of subsequent cognizers: conceptual subsequent cognizers and non-conceptual subsequent cognizers. And then we'll keep going. So the examples of a conceptual subsequent cognizer are a remembering consciousness, remembering blue, that is generated through being induced by a sense direct perceiver apprehending blue, and the second moment of an inferential cognizer realizing sound to be impermanent. Right. So you get this idea. So first of all, remember, like according to this tenet system, and I mentioned this before, but they differ. The Prasanghikas don't differ on this point about new. But this tenet system and other Buddhist tenet systems like the mind only say that valid cognite, part of the definition, right? There were three parts: new, incontrovertible, and knower, right? So if it's so according to this goal of pramana, a valid cognizer has to be a new knowing, right? So so now they mention, well, there are ways of knowing that are not new, where you already knew something, but your mind is still on that, right? So that would be a subsequent cognizer. And what this is getting at, right, is that there are conceptual subsequent cognizers, right, which know something conceptually, and then there are non-conceptual ones, which are direct perceivers, right, and know things non-conceptually. And so, regarding conceptual subsequent cognizers, right, by definition, is something if you look at the above part of the first part of the definition, a knower realizing that which has been already been realized, right? So, so one type is a remembering consciousness, right? And so, let me put this out. So what they're getting at is sometimes a subsequent cognizer can be remembering something that you initially knew via direct perception, but then had a mental awareness of, and now you're remembering it, right? So by definition, that's subsequent cognizing because you already realized it. So if I, he gives the example here of blue, but I mean, it could be, if you think of your childhood friend, right, and remember their face right now, right, some friend of yours from childhood, that's a subsequent cognizer, right? It's not a new incontrovertible knower. It's something, you're remembering, right? So that's one kind of subsequent cognizer. And the other kind of subsequent cognizer is, he says here, he gives the example, the second moment of an inferential cognizer realizing sound to be impermanent. So that would be anything you've realized, right? So in other words, you realize something through inferential cognition, and then if you continue to dwell on that knowledge after the initial knowing of it, it's a subsequent cognizer. So you get the idea. Those are something you've already realized or known, and later moments of knowing that are subsequent cognitions of it. Then the other, so that's, and those are subsequent cognitions that are conceptual. Then he points out there are also non-conceptual subsequent cognizers, and he gives the example, an example of a non-conceptual subsequent cognizer is the second moment of a sense direct perceiver apprehending form, right? And so that would be like, if you look at something, there's a first moment where you would say, realize it or initially apprehend it, newly apprehend it. But if you continue looking at it or listening to it or touching it or something, then it becomes those moments after the first, when it's new, are subsequent cognitions. Right? And that would apply, right? Like if I were touching, if I touch a pen, the first moment of touching it would be a tactile valid direct perception. But as I continue to hold it, and if I'm focusing on the tactile sensation, those would be subsequent direct, non-conceptual, right? Tactile cognition or knowing, you can say apprehension. So anyway, so that's subsequent cognizers. They're pretty straightforward, actually, and pretty simple. Then the second of these five starts, and this is, I mentioned at the end of class last time, but I want to kind of bring this up again because I think that this is very useful. So the second of these five begins a series of three, right, which are wrong consciousness, doubt, and correct assumption. And we're going to go through those, but I just want to say something about them in terms of a sequence, which is kind of what I started to bring up last time, which is in terms of our own inner work, our own spiritual practice, our own, development personally on the spiritual path. From the perspective of this school, and in general, this applies to higher schools also. There's a process we go through, right? And so I want to, where we start off with wrong cognitions, develop doubt about our own wrong cognitions, hopefully. Eventually reach a correct assumption, And then I want to bring, this is where I was saying there are 7 ways of knowing, and eventually come to a correct inferential cognition, or a correct inferential valid cognition, and then to a direct perception. And in a sense, that's the, you could say these kinds of knowing happen with everything, right? All of our, like, how do you know you had lunch? How do you know you, whatever, sneezed or something? They apply to all kinds of knowing. But obviously, if you're trying to become liberated from samsara or enlightened, then there are some very important things to know, aren't there? Like selflessness or emptiness, right? Like impermanence, like I was mentioning last time, the faults of self-centeredness and the benefits of love, things like that, right? And one thing I want to point out is that, so I was sort of saying last time this part, but so what's important then is that we come to recognize or sort of our own wrong cognitions, right? And regarding, say, the ultimate truth of emptiness, we're in a state ordinarily of wrong cognition, right? Where we're grasping at an independent, truly existent, substantially existent self, right? So that's a really important version of a wrong cognition, isn't it? And what we want is eventually to go through this whole sequence, right? To start with a wrong cognition, develop doubt about that, eventually come to a correct assumption, gain an inferential valid cognition of emptiness, and then eventually gain a direct perception of emptiness. So that idea of these particular set of ways of knowing, again, while they apply to everything, they're an extremely important framework for us to look at in terms of our own spiritual practice. And I mentioned last time, so I want to just mention again as we go through the definitions here, that again, what I want to suggest is that these definitions, initially you're just, what is the definition? But I actually think it's extremely useful to then, once you know these definitions and what these are, to say, all right, well, what's my own? When it comes to, you may say, what is my own way of knowing regarding these various important spiritual topics? And these become a tool then to be honest with ourselves, and to say, well, while I say, oh yes, everything's empty, or while I say, oh yes, bodhicitta is very good, am I in a state of wrong consciousness, or am I in a state of doubt, or am I in a state of, and part of that is that we have to kind of be willing to be honest with ourselves and look honestly at where we're at. Because remember, anyway, so as we go through the definitions, I just want to suggest that to not take, to take these first, you're just learning what they are maybe or something, but to take them as tools for introspection, especially on important spiritual topics. Now, one other point is that these also apply to all kinds of interpersonal topics, right? So, when you think of, how you relate to others, you can apply these as well. Am I in a state of wrong? To ask yourself, and again, I was saying this last time, and I won't keep dwelling on it too much, but, I used to have a Tibetan friend of mine who passed away, but he used to say, when you point at others, most of your fingers are pointing back at yourself. He used to joke that. He'd say, well, if you point this finger at somebody else, these 3 are pointing back at you, And what he was getting at, he was joking, but he would say, we look for somebody else's mistakes, but, as we're doing so, there are three mistakes that we're not seeing in ourselves, kind of thing was his joke. And part of what I'm getting at there is wrong consciousness, right? There is, it's funny, isn't it? If I identify somebody else's wrong consciousness, it's not very helpful usually, is it? Actually, oftentimes it just makes me annoyed with them or something. But if I can recognize my own wrong consciousness, then that's very useful, isn't it? Because then that's the one that I can do the most about. If somebody's asking you for help and you see the wrong consciousness, then maybe it's useful. But most of the time, people don't want your help, actually, too. They want you to leave them alone or shut up or something. So anyway, usually what's useful is to find our own wrong consciousness. And actually, to be truthful, if you can't identify your own wrong consciousness, you're not going to really be very accurate in seeing others anyway, are we? So So this first one, wrong consciousness, the key is we need to identify our own wrong consciousnesses. So the definition of wrong consciousness is a knower that engages its object erroneously or incorrectly. Erroneously or incorrectly. There are two types of wrong consciousness: conceptual wrong consciousness and non-conceptual wrong consciousness. So an example of a conceptual wrong consciousness is the conception apprehending sound to be permanent. Let's continue on. Examples of non-conceptual wrong consciousness are sense consciousnesses to which one moon appears as two moons, or sense consciousness to which a snow mountain appears as blue, right? Where somebody has an eye disease or something of that sort. So you get the idea here. It's like, it's where you apprehend something in a way that's contradictory to the fact of how it exists, right? Sound by its very nature is impermanent. If you perceive it as permanent, that's a wrong consciousness. That's a conceptual wrong consciousness, right? But they're making the point also that we can have non-conceptual wrong consciousnesses, can't we? Because of, and they give example, like typical example, the examples they give here are some kind of physical problem, right? And actually, there's a list we can go over. But usually oftentimes it's the non-conceptual ones. Often it's something wrong with our sense organs. If you have a disease, for example, but sometimes it can also be like they give the example if you're moving, if you're on a boat and you forget that you're moving and it looks like the trees are moving or something, right? And that would be an example, right? Where because of where you're situated or something, you can sometimes, you can perceive something incorrectly in a way that's contrary to the fact of how it exists. But here I just want to point out, right? So this idea, conceptual, I want to go back though to the first of the two, conceptual wrong consciousness, right? And he gives a very simple example of conception apprehending sound to be permanent. But I just want to suggest to contemplate this idea of conceptual wrong consciousness. Because what Buddhism is, and it's weird, isn't it? Like what Buddhism is asserting always, right? Or is often asserting is that, and it's actually, if you think deeply about it, it should be a little disturbing, shouldn't it? That that's what you say, right? The conceptual wrong consciousness plays a humongous role in your life, in my life. Right? In other words, so this idea that we very, very, very often have conceptual wrong consciousnesses, right? That engage with things erroneously, right? Incorrectly. And that starts with our conception, our conceptual way of knowing ourselves. Right? And then actually we engage with the world with all kinds of conceptual wrong consciousnesses. And actually, if you were to, I just want to point that out, like if you think deeply about that one, right? Like, it's almost limitless how much if you try to come up with, like, just in your lifetime, how many wrong conscious moments, and today, how many, right? In terms of how you conceptually engage in who you are. In terms of how and there are all kinds of them though, right? Like, I mean, we perceive things that are Chandrakirti points out, right? Well, actually, Shantideva and Chandrakirti both say this, but actually, Shantideva says, although they want happiness, they destroy their happiness, right? Although they don't want suffering, they run towards suffering. That's because of conceptual wrong consciousnesses, isn't it? There's, we conceive of the cause of happiness and the cause of suffering wrongly, and therefore we create suffering for ourselves and others. Right? And Chandrakirti talks about how he gives these 4 examples where he says, things that are impure, you perceive as pure. Right? Things that are impermanent, you conceive of as permanent. Things that are, like filthy, you conceive of as clean. Things that are contaminated, you conceive of as uncontaminated. And then things that have no self, you conceive of as having a self. And so there are all kinds of wrong consciousness, is my point. And I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's worthwhile. I'll just mention one more point. One time I asked, some of you have heard this story, but one time I remember it was actually, it was very brief. One time, actually many, many years ago, Jan Willis had told me a story that she was walking in Nepal with Lama Yeshe and heard this like echoing laughter coming, like echoing back and forth across the valley. And she kind of stopped and was looking around and she said, "What is that?" And Lama Yeshe said, "It's my student, Zopa." And that's the way Jan tells the story. Professor Willis tells the story. And so I actually, when she told that story was when I decided I wanted to meet Lama Zopa, because I wanted to ask him, what do you laugh about in a cave? And then I realized, then I got to know Lama Zopa and I realized you can't ask him that. He wouldn't answer. But then finally I said, what do yogi? Finally, I did get to ask him. I didn't ask what do you, because he would never have answered, I don't believe. But I asked him, I said, what do yogis laugh about when they laugh in a cave? I asked Lama Zopa that question one time, and he got it wrong consciously. He said, well, yogis sitting in a cave look down at the people, and what they see is those people, like, although happiness comes from loving others, they think being selfish is best. Although everything is impermanent, they think they're permanent. Although they're, although ethics and generosity and so on are the cause of happiness, they do the opposite. They think the opposite is true. Although things have no self, they believe there's a self. And he said, so when the yogi sees that, they have to either cry or laugh. And he said, so sometimes they laugh, basically, was his answer. Right. And so what he was getting at is that from the yogi's perspective, when they look around, what they see is us, right? Completely 100%, like all day and night in the grasp, in the grip of wrong consciousness, right? Of wrong consciousnesses. And so I think so the yogi would laugh and cry, I suppose, at that. But we don't see it, is my point, right? Like, in other words, that was part of the point he was getting at, is that we miss that, right? We act and think we're brilliant in our assessment of things when we're totally wrong oftentimes, most of the time, actually. And so, at this point, right, and I'm just going off on a little bit of even more of a tangent now. Like, I remember being struck, and also it was Jan Willis's book. Jan Willis wrote and edited that book called Enlightened Beings, which is the life stories of Gelugpa Mahasiddhas. And one thing that really struck me when I read that book, it talks about, they were great tantric siddhas, right? Great tantric masters who spent years in retreat. One thing that struck me, though, when I read that, so it tells the life story of a number of these different great Mahasiddhas, these great yogis, tantric masters. And one thing that really struck me as I read through each of their biographies was that each one, it mentions they studied pramana. And I was like, wow, that's kind of funny. They studied logic and epistemology. Usually when you think of a Mahasiddha, you think, they just studied Tantra and they ran off to mountains or something. But it was getting at what I think I was like contemplating that. I was like, it's the same point Lama Zopa Rinpoche was making, right? I asked him about Mahasiddhas in a cave, right? And it was the same thing, actually, right? It was that the person has to realize the truth, right, of how things exist. And that's what this teaching is about, right? And so they have to understand their own wrong content. They have to do this process, right? And it's not like you can go off to the whatever, if you're going to be in your own home or you're going to go off to the Himalayas, it doesn't matter where you are. What I realized when I was reading that, I was like, oh, wow, everybody has to realize our own wrong consciousnesses, right? And then go through this process that this teaching is describing, right, of working through our wrong consciousnesses. So I think this small point about what is a wrong consciousness, he just gives it very simply, right? He gives examples and he says it knows things erroneously. But my point is that's huge, right? Like, you could say that like most of our spiritual process is this. is identifying our own wrong consciousnesses and correcting them. Because if you actually, I'll make, yeah, also like in the, what's it called? The Pramana Vartika by Dharmakirti. He refers to the Buddha and Dignaga also. Those are the two great masters who founded sort of Buddhist logic and epistemology textual study. I mean, there are texts in the sutras that say that, but they kind of started deep analysis of this topic. And they refer to the Buddha as a valid being. Like the Buddha is a pramana being. Whereas meaning the Buddha sees everything validly, right? A Buddha doesn't have any wrong consciousness. And what they're getting at is the same point I was just making in a way, right? Which is we're wrong consciousness beings. Buddhas are valid beings, right? Buddhas are beings who see everything validly. And so in a way, the process of spiritual development is to go from wrong consciousness to valid cognition, actually, to knowing things incontrovertibly and correctly. So this is a huge topic anyway. So that's wrong consciousness, that a knower that engages its object erroneously. And again, like you could say that's like a mirror that we're supposed to look in, and say, oh, well, that might be me. So then after that, and I was starting to explain this last class, so after that comes doubt, right? And part of the point is I just want to mention, right, is, doubt is in Buddhist psychology, doubt is a variable mental factor. So in other words, if there's something that's correct and you doubt it, that's a negative thing, right? So in other words, that's not helpful to you. But doubt can be very useful when you're in a state of wrong consciousness, right? In other words, the first step is to start doubting your own wrong consciousness, right? So doubt can be a positive thing or a negative thing. But here, I'll just give the definition. The definition of doubt is a mental factor that by its own force hesitates with respect to two alternatives, right? So it goes back and forth between two alternatives about a certain topic. Then it says the mental consciousness concomitant with doubt and its accompanying feeling are not that which by their own force hesitate with respect to two alternatives, because they hesitate with respect to two alternatives due to the force of that doubt. So now it says there are three types of doubt. Doubt tending towards the factual, doubt tending away from the factual, and even doubt. I'll just continue on to the end of this little section, then I'll comment on it. So it says, an example of doubt tending toward the factual is a doubt that thinks sound is probably impermanent. A doubt tending away from the factual is a doubt that thinks sound is probably permanent. An example of an even doubt is a doubt that thinks sound could be either permanent or impermanent. It says, I don't know, right? And so you get the idea here. So first of all, if you're in a state of wrong consciousness, then just to even develop, even to start with doubt, tending away from the factual is a good starting point, right? Where you start to go, if you start off thinking like there's definitely a truly existent self, right? And then if you go, I think there is, but I'm not sure anymore, right? That's progress. Like if you hear, let's say, you hear a Lama give a teaching and you go, wow, what I think I've believed my whole life, I think is still true, but maybe I'm wrong. That would be an example. That's a good starting point though, isn't it? Because it's like you start to doubt your own wrong consciousness. And part of the point here is that, they're describing though a psychological process that can happen regarding knowing anything. That's one point. There's anything we know we can have doubts about, right? But anyway, so if it's a doubt related to these spiritual goals or spiritual awarenesses, then and if you have a wrong consciousness, then oftentimes we kind of gradually go through from doubt leading in the wrong direction to even doubt to doubt leading in the correct direction. And I think somebody once pointed out that, for many people, their relationship to emptiness would be a doubt leading, if you've studied emptiness for quite a while, then you might eventually reach a point where you have doubt leading in the correct direction. which is quite a huge accomplishment, right? And I mentioned before, that's what Aryadeva, right, the Nagarjuna's disciple and the great master, says, with regards to emptiness, even a doubt about this matter tears samsara to shreds, right? He says, and that's where the commentary says that's doubt leading in the correct direction. So if you can get to the level of doubt leading in the correct direction with regards to the ultimate truth, that's a big accomplishment. And somebody as exalted as Aryadeva himself says that tears samsara to shreds. It's a huge progress. And another point I'll make is, so and how does, so doubt is of two minds, right? You're going, maybe it's like this, maybe it's like that. And this, obviously, we have doubts about all kinds of things in real life, don't we? We have, in daily life, you have all kinds of doubt. And the idea in this, this doesn't mention it here, but the idea is this is where you engage with reasoning, right? With logic, with, in order to, because the idea is that, is to resolve our doubts through either direct perception or through reasoning, right? Through inferential logic. So the idea is that you contemplate, and a lot of contemplative meditation is designed to help us bring up, look at, and resolve our own doubts about topics. So when you do contemplative meditation, part of what you're trying to do actually is sort of, because a lot of times actually we think we know something actually, and it's just we haven't even bothered to, address our own doubts. Does that make sense? And so the idea is that you have to stir up or face your own doubts and then work through them. And then you can eventually come to, progress through them and change. But anyway, so those are the three types of doubt. And again, I just point out, so we need to, these are tools to recognize where am I at in relation to different things, right? What level, where am I in a state of doubt? And then what do I want to do about that, right? Is this something I can reason about? Sometimes, of course, you doubt if it's about something that's not yet knowable, that's a different question. Right? If you want to know, whatever, you get my point. And then, okay, and this is getting at this process of reasoning now. So I'll cover the next one, and then after that, I'll sort of pause. The definition of a correct assumption, that's the next one, right? So I was going through these three, of the five, these are three, right? Wrong consciousness, doubt, and then correct assumption. The definition of a correct assumption is a factually concordant determinative knower that is controvertible in determining its object. So do you notice the difference between a correct assumption and inferential valid cognition, right? Inferential valid cognizers are incontrovertible, right? They're definitive, they're incontrovertible, they know in a kind of way that's definitive. Whereas correct assumptions are controvertible. In other words, they actually are factually concordant, right? And they determine something and the person thinks about it and they do know it in a sense, right? They're a knower, but they're controvertible. They're not, what's the word? Yeah, they're not definitive, or they're not authoritative, or they're not, like that. They can be reversed. And then this gets, actually, let's go through this. But again, as we go through these, I just want to say these are, as I've been saying, these are tools to look at ourselves, and especially about these spiritually significant topics. So there are 5 types of correct assumptions. I'll just read them and then he describes them. So correct assumptions without a reason, correct assumptions with a contradictory reason, correct assumptions with an indefinite reason, correct assumptions with an inapplicable reason, and correct assumptions with a correct but undetermined reason. And what this is getting at, right, I just want to point out, correct assumption means it's factually concordant, right? So that means it's correct, actually, right? This is you could say it's a belief, it's a thought that's correct, but it's not definitive. You don't actually know it in a definitive way, right? And in a way that's through the power of your own reasoning. if that makes sense. So the first one, right, is correct assumptions without a reason. An awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent in dependence upon the mere words, sound is impermanent, is, for an example, an illustration of a correct assumption without a reason. Because although the words, sound is impermanent, express the thesis that sound is impermanent, a correct reason why sound is impermanent is not stated. So here, what we're getting at, right, what he's getting at is, so correct assumption believes something that's correct, that's true, but it doesn't have any reason for believing it. So if you were to say, if you were to think, well, I believe, he gives the example, sound is impermanent, right? Like if you say, well, my Lama said sound's impermanent, right? That would be, somebody said so, right? That's not a valid cognition, right? You have to have some kind of valid reasoning. There's no valid reasoning for you behind that. So it's controversial. Then somebody else will say something else and you'll believe that. Does that make sense? And oftentimes, right, if you say, well, I believe, if you listen to the Dalai Lama teach on emptiness and you say, wow, yeah, all things are empty of intrinsic existence, right? And then if you really ask yourself, why do I believe that? And your actual, if your honest answer with yourself is, well, the Dalai Lama kind of said that, he's great. That would be a correct assumption without a reason, right? In other words, it's not through, you don't have an actual, that doesn't prove, and the Buddha said, right? That's why the Buddha said, don't take my teachings as true out of faith in me. Subject them, right, to like gold, like a goldsmith tests gold to burning and rubbing and scraping and so on, right? Like the idea here is that you have to know it for yourself, right? If you don't know a thing for yourself through your own process of reasoning, then that's not sufficient. Then it's just a correct assumption without a reason. And do you see how, like, I don't know, I mean, as I read this, like, it's like, it takes humility, doesn't it? If you admit to yourself, like, after many years of studying emptiness, I believe it without, but I haven't yet realized the reason. It takes humility to come to that, right? But without that humility, we don't make progress, right? And I remember, I was struck by this, like, one time there was like a talk, after the biography of Tsongkhapa came out. Thupten Jinpa did a beautiful biography of Tsongkhapa, and he gave a talk, and he said, Tsongkhapa spends like decades and decades and decades, right, studying emptiness, doing retreats on emptiness, like studying the great classics, and then going into do years and years of retreat. And Thupten Jinpa made this comment. He said, when you finish your Geshe degree, when you become a Larampa Geshe, which is what he achieved, that degree, he said, you study Majjhimaka, right, emptiness, for a few years in the monastery. You debate on it and you pass your exam. And then he said, he made a joke. He kind of said, and one has some feeling like, oh, now I know that. I know that topic. I studied, I got my degree. And then he said, but then he had to pause and say, well, I'm not as brilliant as Tsongkhapa, of course, and I just spent a few years studying it. I didn't do decades of retreat. I didn't wander all over the, and then you have to go, so then realizing do I know it in some definitive way? And by comparing to Tsongkhapa, he was saying, well, then of course you start to have some doubt. Maybe I don't, what I thought I know, maybe I don't know, right? In the same way that I thought I knew it. And that's getting at these points, right? About, do I really know it incontrovertibly? It's asking the question. So the first one is correct assumption without a reason, right? The next one, with a contradictory reason, right? An awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign, empty of the ability to perform a function, is, for an example, an illustration of a correct assumption with a contradictory reason, because empty of being able to perform a function is contradictory with sound, right? So that would be where you're, in other words, you actually, you have a reasoning that you present, but your reasoning is incorrect with regards to the thing you're talking about. Does that make sense? And so this one is not just without a reason, like you actually have reasoning, it's just your reasoning is wrong. Does that make sense? So, and it doesn't apply to the topic you're talking about. And actually, I want to challenge you, I'm going to suggest a homework assignment that, again, I don't check these, so it's up to you. But I actually want to suggest a homework assignment to go through these 5 kinds of correct assumption and to come up with an example of yourself. Does that make sense? Not of somebody else. Like, because it's really easy to come up with examples of other people, isn't it? Who have these wrong, well, or they may have wrong views, I mean, but actually, yeah, to do it with all of these, actually. So to come up, actually, my suggestion would be that, would be to, with regards to the wrong consciousness, the 3 types of doubt, and the 5 types of correct assumption. So like take a piece of paper and write those down, and then come up with examples of each in yourself. Does that make sense? Because that's the point here, right? So here it would be, you believe something, but your reason behind it is wrong, right? It doesn't apply to the topic at hand. Yeah. So yeah, it's and actually your reason is the opposite of, like, right. So in his example here, right, empty perform a function, right? Well, sound does perform a function, right? It's a functioning thing. So it's actually the opposite of the fact, right? But their conclusions, they somehow come to the person here comes to the conclusion, therefore sound is impermanent, right? So if they don't, and again, it's like, if the person doesn't go deeply enough into it, they won't. Actually, I'm just going to share. I'm going off. I mean, I just think these are useful topics. I'll share another example. I remember one time I was it was Kent Rinpoche used to give these teachings for like 9 days a year in New York City. We would all stay at this house, and in New York City, Leon, a friend, was very generous and letting people stay, and a group would hang out. And so we would oftentimes we would sit on the front stoop and debate whatever Rinpoche had been talking about. And I guess I was pointing, so, and one thing I started to notice was like Geshe Darge and Geshe Tashi were often there. And I remember like, and I'm pointing this out because I think it's true of all of us. I remember one time like watching, so I was watching, both of them did the same thing, but I remember one day Geshe Tashi was wonderful. He was doing this thing where he took the wrong view and he was arguing for it, right? So he intentionally, I mean, he's a very smart person, and intentionally he took the wrong position and was arguing for that. And then, and so other people were then taking the right position and trying to argue for that. Does that make sense? In a debate. And I was watching, so first, like I would watch, so the Geshe Tashi in this case, first he was arguing very well, right? And you can see the other people would start getting self-conscious, like afraid to get it wrong, right? So they would kind of hold back and they were like being nervous. And then I was watching Geshe Tashi, and he started like giving people hints of how to beat him. And I was like, oh, wow, like he was doing that to a particular friend. And I realized, like, because the debate had gone on for a while and people's like egos had gotten stirred up or something, it was like, I was like, oh, wow, my friend isn't noticing. Geshe Tashi's like throwing him, he's saying, a kid, like throwing him an easy pitch or something, like he was like giving him a hint of how to, Tashi wanted to lose the debate, right? Because his point wasn't to win, it was education, right? It was insight. And, but in that moment, I remember noticing, oh, wow, my friend can't notice that Tashi's giving him a break here, because Tashi wants him to see, like, oh, this is the wrong view here, or this is the wrong assumption or something. But what happens sometimes is we don't want to admit, I was like, oh, I do that too. It's like where we don't want to admit that we're wrong, or we don't want to make ourselves vulnerable to recognize I'm the one holding the wrong position, or I don't have a correct reasoning, or my reasoning is flawed, and I was like, oh, wow, so you have to be willing to admit to yourself or to somebody else that you don't know, or that you're confused, or that your reasoning might be off, right? And we have to be willing to do that, if that makes sense, right? We have to be willing to put ourselves out there, whether it's with ourselves or with somebody else, to sort of, what's the word? To discover the ways in which we maybe have a wrong reasoning, right? Because actually, I'll just point that out. Like in this example, with the contradictory reason, there is the person who thinks sound is impermanent because it's empty of perform a function. They don't think that's a wrong reason, right? They think that's a correct reason. And they would have to be willing to listen to somebody else say, wait a second, but sound does perform a function Here's the proof that sounds performs a function, right? But if you're too defended and too uptight or something, then you don't, you say, oh, I don't want to talk about it, or something like that, right? Or no, you're just being whatever, or because there's this feeling of defensiveness or something. So we have to be willing to engage in reasoning on our own or with other people to uncover our assumptions that we don't actually have a reason. We just say, I know this, but we don't want to admit, I don't know. I don't even have a reason. Or we don't want to explore, maybe my reason's wrong, and then you think, wow, I've been interested in Buddhism for a while, and yet my reasoning's wrong. How embarrassing or something. But the point is that we have to do that if we want to make progress, right? And otherwise we stay stuck at whatever point we're at and we don't progress. And then the next one, correct assumption with an indefinite reason, which is a reason that doesn't prove the point, right? So he gives the example, an awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign object of comprehension is, for example, an illustration of a correct assumption with an indefinite reason because of being an object of comprehension is an indefinite reason to establish sound to be impermanent. So he's getting at is, right, if you say, that would be like if somebody said, object of comprehension means if somebody said all things are impermanent, therefore sound is impermanent, right? Well, that's an indefinite reason because according to Buddhism, we've covered this before, impermanent means changing instant by instant. And not all things change instant by instant. Right? Uncompounded space, emptiness doesn't change. There are various things that don't have to be. They're not necessarily eternal, but they aren't something changing instant by instant. And so what this is getting at is sometimes we have a reason that's not. It doesn't prove the point, or it's not definitive regarding that point. And again, so then we think we're engaging in a kind of inference or reasoning, but our reasoning is not definitive, and therefore our knowing can't be definitive. Does that make sense? I'll cover the next two, and then I'll stop and stop for questions after I finish these 5 kinds of correct assumption. So the next one is correct assumption with an inapplicable reason, and he gives the example. An awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign object of apprehension of an I consciousness is, for example, an illustration of a correct assumption with an inapplicable reason. Because being an object of apprehension of an I consciousness is an inapplicable reason for proving sound to be impermanent, right? Because sound is the apprehension of an ear consciousness, right? And obviously Jetsun Chog Yeltsin's using sound as impermanent for all of these just to get across what they are. But this is why I want to suggest that homework assignment. I want to suggest really trying to come up with, okay, so what's an example where I have believed something for an inapplicable reason, right? Again, because that's where it's useful, if that makes sense. Otherwise, who cares if somebody else believes something? It's not going to help you, or it's not going to help anybody necessarily. Unless you realize the things if I realize the things I have a wrong reasoning, or an inapplicable reason in this case. And then the last of the 5 is an interesting one. Correct assumptions with the correct but undetermined reason. And I'll read what he says and I'll explain it. He says, an awareness apprehending sound to be impermanent by the sign product in the continuum of a person who has not ascertained by a valid cognizer that sound is impermanent is, for an example, an illustration of a correct assumption with a correct but undetermined reason. Because although being a product is the correct reason to establish that sound is impermanent, that correct reason has not been determined by that person. And so this last type of correct assumption is where you actually can say, right? Probably most of the time this one would be because you heard it from somebody else, right? Who's correct. That you can say the correct reason, right? That you know the correct reason, but you haven't determined, but so there's something that proves it, right? In this case, that sound is a product, right? That arose due to causing conditions does prove it's impermanent. But if you haven't realized yourself that sound is a product, and you haven't realized yourself that products are impermanent, right? Then you have the correct reason, but it's undetermined for you. Does that make sense? So for you, it's not going to give rise to a valid cognition. Actually, I want to, and this one, for those who are like serious in their interest in Buddhism, it's easy to get this one, to have this one happen, right? So for example, like, I gave the example earlier, if you were to say, oh, the Dalai Lama said all things are empty of inherent existence, they're empty of inherent existence, right? That would be correct assumption without a reason, right? But if you were to listen more carefully to the Dalai Lama, and then you heard the Dalai Lama say, all things are empty of intrinsic existence because they're dependent arising, right? You say, oh, now I have the correct reason. I know all things are empty of inherent existence because they're dependent arising, right? Now I have a correct assumption in that moment, maybe, possibly, maybe in a still, I may not, but if I've thought about that some, right? And if I've thought about that some and I really am interested in that, I might come to the point where I go, yeah, that's right. But the question is, have you yourself realized that it's a dependent arising? And have you realized that that which is a dependent arising must therefore be empty of intrinsic existence? If not, then you have not come to an inferential valid cognition, right? You have the correct reason, but it's undetermined for you. In other words, you have not determined the truth of that reasoning. And so therefore it's not incontrovertible, right? If somebody later said, you don't know from your own reasoning, actually, for your own determinative, what's the word? Yeah, determinative and definitive process of sort of analyzing it, you don't know that that's true. So later, if somebody, and actually that's where, like, so if somebody were to say all things are empty of intrinsic existence because they're dependent arising, and if you came to you might say, oh yeah, like it's almost like a belief, right? Oh, that's right, that's the reason. But then if somebody else were to present some, like, oh no, they were to say, but there is an exception, whatever, that Buddhahood is not, Buddhahood is a dependent arising, but it's not empty of inherent existence. It's intrinsically existent from its own side. Then you would say, oh, well, maybe there's an exception, right? And then you would have doubt. You wouldn't know, right? Because you haven't determined the truth of that logic, right? And so the Dalai Lama says this, but then let's say another Buddhist teacher, you went to them and they said, something that contradicted it. So you would think at one moment if you were listening to the Dalai Lama, first you think the Dalai Lama said it. That's a correct assumption without a reason. Then you thought about what he had said and you wrote it down and you went over it. And let's say you came to the point of a correct assumption with an undetermined reason. You hadn't realized the reason, but you could say what it was and you kind of knew it. But then somebody else comes along and presents a different view, right? Then you might say, oh, well, there are exceptions to what the Dalai Lama said. There are exceptions to that. Not all dependent arisings are empty, right? Maybe, I don't know. Now you're back in doubt. Does that make sense? So that's why it's not incontrovertible. Does that make sense? Incontrovertible, which would be an inferential valid cognizer, means you yourself have determined the truth, and they call it the truth of the reason, right? Or what does he call it? The sign. The sign means like the proof, right? But also they call it the forward and reverse pervasion. Right? In this case, it would be, in my example, right? I said, so the thing to be proven, in my case, I'm just using it. I'll just mention it. So the thing to be proven is all things are empty of inherent existence or intrinsic existence. The reason is they're dependent arising, right? But then there has to be you have to be able to know then that all things that are empty, all things that are dependent arisings must be empty of intrinsic existence. And things that are empty of intrinsic existence are dependent arising, right? You'd have to know through your own reasoning that that's all true. Otherwise, it's not determined for you. Does that make sense? And so that would be an example of correct assumption where you have a correct reason, but you haven't realized the truth of that reason for yourself. And again, so I'm going to suggest a bunch of homework here that you don't have to do if you don't want to. So one is to use wrong consciousness, the 3 types of doubt, and the 5 types of correct assumption, and look for examples of each of those in your own self. Right, in your own experience. Another one would be regarding certain core Buddhist topics that you personally have an interest in: emptiness, impermanence. I gave an example last time. The faults of self-cherishing and the value of cherishing others, of love. to ask yourself on those, let's say those kind of topics, right? Well, where am I at? Am I at wrong view? Am I at, and if I'm at correct, if I'm at doubt, which level of doubt? Which type of doubt? If I'm at correct assumption, which type of correct assumption am I at? And actually, it's hard to answer. Sometimes if it's hard to answer that question, that's a good sign, actually, right? But that's the work. So if you say, I'm not sure, well, that's okay. That's a good starting point, but that's not an answer, right? Whereas you have to then really challenge yourself to say, no, let me at least admit to myself what level I'm at regarding this point. And that's useful, right? Because then okay, what's my next step? How do I make progress spiritually? So this is a map of how to progress spiritually in many ways, right? Because remember I said, like, the yogi in the cave looks at ordinary people like us and laughs or cries because we're living totally trapped in wrong views. On the other hand, Dharmakirti and Dignaga say, what's a Buddha? A Buddha is a valid being. A Buddha is somebody who every knower, every awareness is correct, right? Is valid cognition. So if we're somebody who's trying to progress along the path, we have to recognize, well, where am I at in my progress on these core spiritual points? And then how do I apply reasoning to go from wrong consciousness all the way up to correct inferential valid cognition, and then eventually to direct valid cognition. For example, with regards to selflessness or emptiness. So I'm going to pause there. I mean, there's one more type of knower, but those were the three that I think are connected to particularly to this progression. So I'm going to pause there just to does anybody have comments or questions about that before I go on? Okay, so it's clear. Good. But yeah, do consider that though. Do consider doing the homework. Like, actually apply these to yourself, because then it's really useful. Otherwise, it's just knowledge, but it's not so helpful. Anyway, then there's one more type of knower of the 5 that are listed here, which is, which actually it will be familiar to. That one was the awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained. So the definition of an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained is a non-mistaken knower that has a clear appearance of his object but does not ascertain it. There are 3 types of awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained. Sense direct perceivers that are awarenesses to which an object appears but is not ascertained. Mental direct perceivers that are awarenesses to which an object appears but is not ascertained, and self-knowing direct perceivers that are an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained. And then I'll just keep going. So the first is an example of a sense direct perceiver that is an awareness to which an object appears but is not ascertained is an ear conscious apprehending sound at the time when the eyes are engrossed in a beautiful form. And that, one way else, when you, I don't know, if you, other teachings on this point out, like when it says not ascertained, it means like, and actually we often, I mean, I often catch myself having these where like, it's like you can't remember. It's not ascertained in the sense that you don't, like, in other words, you were there and you perceived the thing, but you didn't really ascertain it because you were distracted or you were focused on something else, and therefore it didn't, you didn't ascertain it and you can't remember it. And so like there are often times where Shayla will say, "Don't you remember this?" And I'll say, "What?" And then, "What do you mean?" You say, "Remember we were at dinner and that person did that," or whatever. The person at the other table was like that. And I'll say, "What?" Oh, not this past year and a half, of course, but I'm just giving an example from before the pandemic. But I'll say, "What? They were doing what?" Or like an something like that, or so there'll be like, in other words, I didn't ascertain it, right? I was focused on something else and I didn't even notice, or yeah. Anyway, so and that could be, and again, he gives the example, if you're focused with your eyes, you may not hear something, we don't hear something, or if you're focused on listening and you missed a visual cue, or you can be focused on one aspect of the visual field and you don't notice something else happening in your peripheral vision. There are all kinds of examples of this direct perceivers to which an object appears but is not ascertained. Then mental examples of a mental direct perceiver that are awarenesses to which an object appears but not ascertained, are mental direct perceivers in the continuum of ordinary being, apprehending the five objects, form, and so on. And I mentioned this before. So this means, what this is getting at is that when you directly perceive something with a sense organ, like so your eye consciousness, or with a sense organ and a sense consciousness, so you see something, you hear something, then Tsongkhapa's position is then there's at the end, after that sense direct perception, there's a moment of mental direct perception of that object, which, as it says here, ordinary beings, that's why it mentions in the continuum of an ordinary being. Ordinary beings don't notice that. It happens for us, but we don't notice it. It's happening. It happens so quickly and so briefly that we're not aware that we're having that mental direct perception. And so it happens, but it's something that ordinary people aren't aware of. And what he says, ordinary beings, is that Arya beings, those who have seen selflessness in this school, can actually notice that process. They can be aware of how they have the mental direct perception for a moment, and then that becomes part of their way of knowing. And then examples of self-knowing direct perceivers that are awarenesses to which an object appears but is not ascertained, are self-knowers in the continuum of an ordinary being that experience a mental direct perceiver apprehending the five objects. So what it's saying is, if you're not aware of that moment of mental direct perception, then for sure you're not going to be aware of the self-knower that's aware of that mental direct perceiver, because you weren't even aware of the mental direct perceiver, right? So that's clear. Yeah, we'll continue on. Then it says, now this is a section on object possessors. And now he makes a general point. He says there are three types of object possessors, right? And this is why, actually, I just want to say, if you think of it as subject and object, this would be the subject, right? And so there are three types of object possessors or subjects. One is beings, right? And what they're getting at there is, because sometimes we say, right, I knew, I saw this, I knew this, right? So, and that's a correct use of terminology, so it's not incorrect, right? So in other words, in general, you can say a person is a subject or a knower, right? Because the person, so if you say I saw blue, then the person, in that sentence, or that sentence we say, the person is the object possessor. A second type of object possessor is speech, right? And what that's getting at is, in Buddhist philosophy, they sometimes say, so that language, in this sense, it's not a consciousness, and it's not a person. But when we say, like language can express form, sound, smell, taste, right? So if you say bitter, right, to describe a flavor, right, that term is a way of knowing, or a way of getting at, you could say, the taste of bitterness. It's not the same as the taste of bitterness, but it's a term that gets at that. So that's an object possessor, or it's kind of in that sense. I sort of hesitate in a way, because sometimes I personally think, well, there's a sense in which that's an object possessor because it's referring to that thing. It's not, and it's a way of, I guess it's a way of inducing knowledge. And then valid cognizers. So, and valid, you'll see now, this is my main point here, is those are consciousnesses, right? And usually in Buddhism, we're referring to consciousnesses when we say object possessors. So here, the broader point really is that Justin Shogi Gelson saying, mostly I've been talking about consciousnesses, but there are other types of object possessors. That's really the point, I think, of this short paragraph. Then he says there are three types of valid object possessors: valid beings, valid speech, and valid consciousness. And this is getting at what I was just mentioning a few minutes ago. An example of a valid being is said to be the teacher, Buddha Shakyamuni, right? So that's what I was saying earlier, just a few minutes ago. I was saying that Dharmakirti and Dignaga refer to the Buddha as a valid being, or a pramana being, right? In the sense that the Buddha, as a knower, always knows in a valid way, never has a wrong consciousness, never has a doubt, never has a correct assumption even, right? All the Buddha's knowledge is pramana, is valid cognition. Next, an example of valid speech is said to be the turning of the wheel of Dharma of the Four Noble Truths, right? And that it's valid because it describes validly the nature of things. Right? An example of a valid consciousness, examples of valid consciousnesses are direct valid cognizers and inferential valid cognizers. Right? And so, so for example, we're capable of having for example, an inferential valid cognizer or a direct valid cognizer. We have those. So those are types of valid cognition. And I think, yeah, there's time. So actually, I'll complete this. I think today we'll complete the section on the Sutra School. So it's good. And then and then I'll sort of pause for questions. So next, there are two more sections, and they're pretty brief actually for this school. So the way of asserting selflessness. So it says the person's emptiness of being permanent, unitary, and independent is asserted to be the coarse selflessness of persons. And the person's emptiness of being self-sufficient, substantially existent is asserted to be the subtle selflessness of persons. They are similar to proponents of the Great Exposition or the Vaibhashika school in not accepting a selflessness of phenomena. So in a very general sense, that presentation is the same as the Vaibhashikas. See, like, right, so in other words, the Vaibhashikas don't assert a selflessness of phenomena, and the Sautantrikas also don't assert a selflessness of phenomena. Also, same thing, right? The Vaibhashikas say that coarse selflessness is the emptiness of being a permanent, unitary, independent self. This school agrees with that, and that subtle selflessness of persons is the emptiness of being a self-sufficient, substantially resistant self. So that is all of those points. They're the same actually as the in terms of that presentation. Those points are the same as for the Vaibhashikas. And so, so therefore, this section doesn't go into much detail because it's basically saying on these points, the general idea is the same, those general points are the same as the Vaibhashikas. And they also would say, like the Vaibhashikas, right, that the permanent unitary independent self, that grasping at that, is a, what's it called, like an acquired, it's not the innate form of self-grasping. It's an acquired, so that's like grasping, through learning, through wrong learning, or actually it's a wrong consciousness, right? And actually think about it, right? These self-grasping minds are wrong consciousnesses, right? So the grasping at a permanent unitary independent self would be a conceptual wrong consciousness that is acquired due to learning a wrong tenet system, right? Like, so if you learn that there's a eternal soul, for example, and then you grasp at that, that would be an example of a permanent unitary independent, right? And then the mind grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self is another type of, it's a subtler type of wrong consciousness. And both this school and the Vaibhashikas would say that can be acquired through learning, but it's also innate. There's also an innate form of that in everybody. And that innate form of that is, has been with us since beginningless time, is the root cause of samsara. And it's in the overcoming of that we achieve liberation, right? And so I just want to pause here and note, right? So what this is getting at, if you connect this to what we were just studying, right, is what's the most important wrong consciousness from a perspective of liberation? The most important wrong consciousness is the innate mind, innate meaning, not intellectual, but not intellectually acquired in this life, but innate in the sense, innate doesn't mean it's there intrinsically, right, or inseparably from the mind. Innate means it's been there since beginningless time, that it's been our habit since beginningless time. So I'm going to point out the most important, from a spiritual perspective in terms of liberation, and according to this school, the most important wrong consciousness is the self-grasping mind, right, that grasps at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And so just for a moment, I'm just going to go off on a very short tangent here that connects this to what we just studied, right? So we all have that wrong consciousness, and we're never separated from that wrong consciousness. Right? And from this school's perspective, all that we just studied, right? The main, the main purpose, you could say, of it is for you and me to start developing doubt in that wrong consciousness, right? To go, wow, I believe I have this self-sufficient, substantially existent self, but maybe I'm wrong, right? That's actually, in a sense, you hear the Four Noble Truths and you think, wow, there's maybe that's the cause of suffering. And the Buddha says that's not real, that self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Right? And so you start asking questions, you start wondering, right? And again, you can see how, right, you have a wrong consciousness that totally believes that. Then you start to have doubt, right? When you first begin to go, maybe it's not real. Maybe I was wrong, right? That's doubt, because you have two minds, right? Then eventually you develop an even doubt, where you go, wow, maybe the Buddha's right, maybe I was right. I'm not really sure. Right? I joked last time that I think even doubt is what Socrates sort of, right, when he said, to know what you don't know, right? To have an even doubt is progress. I think it was part of Socrates' point. And then eventually you would come to doubt leading in the correct direction, right? Which would be like going, where you're going, wow, I've been listening to this guy, the Buddha, quite a bit. I think he's probably right. There's probably not a self. And you sort of be contemplating why, right? And actually, then, I just want to point this out, then you would get to, eventually, if you kept thinking about it, you might come to various kinds of correct assumptions, right? And you might go back and forth between those 5 types. One day you might think, no, the Buddha said it, so it must be true, right? Then you would be thinking about it, going, well, he said it for this reason, right? And then maybe you'd misremember the reason, so you'd have an inapplicable reason or contradictory reason. You'd keep thinking about it, and eventually you'd come to a point where you had the correct assumption with the correct reason, but it wasn't determined for you, right? An undetermined correct reason. And actually, do you see how the undetermined, I just want to point something out, right? When you come to the point where you have a correct assumption with the correct reason, but it's not yet determined for you, that's really important, isn't it? Because then that's like the step right before you can maybe reach the point of an inferential cognition or inferential valid cognition of it, right? Because now you know the correct reason and you're thinking about the correct reason and you're exploring that correct reason. And eventually, if you determine the truth of the correct reason, right? You see how you have to determine that reason actually proves the thing you're trying to prove. Then you have to determine for yourself that the reason actually is a correct reason, that it actually fits the facts of the situation, right? And if you determine those things, then you'll come eventually to an inferential valid cognition of selflessness. You see how it makes sense, right? That would eventually happen. And according to this school, then what happens, right? That's huge, right? Because then you can meditate, you can develop, that's insight, actually, what we call insight, right? That's an actual insight into selflessness. Now, if you have calm abiding, right? And then you contemplate over and over again that insight, it becomes special insight, vipassana. That's what this school is saying, is that then it's shamatha in union, if you have shamatha, calm abiding, and you have that insight through inferential valid cognition, right? Then you try to combine those. And eventually you succeed in combining them, right? And then that's what's called the union of calm abiding and special insight. That's what that is, the union of calm abiding and special insight. But you have to have a valid inferential cognition or you won't have the insight to become special insight in combination with your meditation, right? And that's where actually, sometimes they say actually there's 3 types of wisdom, right? There's the wisdom of listening. That's where you heard it, right? You thought about it a little bit. Then there's the reasoning, then there's the wisdom that arises through contemplation. That's where you've had the inferential valid cognition. Does that make sense? When they say wisdom arisen through contemplation, it's where you gain that wisdom that arises through through inferential cognition. And the wisdom arisen through meditation is for the person who has calm abiding, right? And they combine that inferential cognition, inferential valid cognition, with their meditative absorption. And eventually they combine calm abiding and special insight, or shamatha and vipassana. And that's actually, then they've entered the path of preparation, right? Of their own path, of the 5 paths, right? And that eventually leads to, and I'll point out, so according to this school, right, that, and the other schools would agree with this point, that's the entry point to the path of preparation, where now you have an inferential valid cognition, say of the emptiness of there being a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Right? You combine that with your shamatha or your calm abiding, right? And then if you keep doing that over and over in your meditation process, or it could be in one session according to the school, or many sessions, but eventually you come to a point where you have a direct valid cognition, a direct pramana, direct valid cognition of the lack of there being a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And that's the entry point to the path of seeing, right? So you see how that all depends on this previous process, right? At that point, you become an Arya, somebody who's seen emptiness or selflessness directly. And then you achieve liberation. That's the school's presentation, actually, right? So actually, it's interesting, isn't it? This school's presentation, eventually you want to get to this point of a direct, right? Direct means non-conceptual, right? A direct valid cognition of the lack of there being a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. But to get to that direct non-conceptual realization, you have to have the inferential, right? To have the inferential cognition of selflessness, you have to first deal with your doubts, right? You have first to do that and come to a correct assumption where you haven't yet realized the undetermined reason, where the reason's not yet determined for you. But to get to that point, you have to deal with your doubts. To get to that, you have to recognize you have a wrong consciousness. So you see why even recognizing you have a wrong consciousness is really important from a spiritual perspective, because that's where you eventually will then rise up through all those points and come to eventually to a direct, non-conceptual realization of selflessness. So all of these points are interconnected. I'm just sort of laying it out that how all these things we've been talking about are connected in terms of one's own practice. And we've sort of already covered this, but now I'll just say, so the 7th point here is presentation of the grounds and paths. So since for all those 3 lineages, the accumulation of merit is accumulated on all 4 learner's paths, a Buddha's form aggregate is accepted to be a Buddha. The presentation of the obscurations and the way of traversing the grounds and paths and so on is similar to that of the great proponents of great exposition. So really what they're saying there is, in general, this school's presentation of the grounds and paths is similar to that of the Vaibhashikas, so Jetsun Chogyal Gelson is not going to go into detail. And I won't go into detail either. We don't need to recover what we covered in the Vaibhashika school. But he points out one difference here, which is, I don't know if you remember this, but in the section, the section of the grounds and paths on the Vaibhashika school's tenets, he mentioned that the view there was that the form body of a Buddha is not a Buddha. Only the mental body, the mind of a Buddha was a Buddha. And the reason that the Vaibhashikas gave was that the Buddha was an ordinary person, right, when he took birth, right? And their Vaibhashika school was that the Buddha sat down and went through the paths of preparation and seeing and meditation in one session, right? So his body was still the body of an ordinary person, but his mind was the mind of a Buddha. This school disagrees. This school says that that's why it says here in that first paragraph of that section, it says, because the accumulation of merit is accumulated on all 4 learner paths. So what it's getting at is that the Buddha accumulates merit for 3 countless great eons, but this school says he doesn't have to go through the path of preparation, seeing, and meditation in one session. It can happen over the course of many lifetimes. And so therefore, when the Buddha takes birth, he has a special kind of body that's born from merit, the merit of the 3 countless great eons, and that he's already traversed some of those other paths of preparation, for example. And therefore, he has a special kind of body that is the Buddha. So they disagree with the Vaibhashikas on that point. But in general, the rest of their description of the grounds and paths is similar to the Vaibhashikas, so he's not going to go into detail beyond that. Okay, so that completes sort of our study of the followers of Sautantrika. I hope you have a sense of, like, especially from this section on the types of knowers, but also on their presentation of the conventional truths and ultimate truths of the, it's a fascinating tenet system. It's quite profound. And as I was saying earlier, like, even the Prasangikas of Tibet rely on this school's presentation of these ways of knowing. They Prasangikas disagree with some details, for example, that doesn't have to be new to be a valid cognition, but mostly they agree with it, and they rely heavily on that. And not just, like Sakya Pandita and Lama Tsongkhapa and many others throughout the history of Tibet, relied on these teachings on pramana and valid cognition to help understand and to help understand the process of spiritual evolution, and also to help analyze the teachings on emptiness and so on. So elements of this school, first of all, this school in and of itself is interesting, but secondly, elements of it are used by Tibetan masters of all the different tenet systems, or different, as they study other tenet systems. Let me stop there. Any questions about this school? Yeah. Varahi first, I guess.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not sure I understand the distinction between the permanent, unitary, and independent person and the self-sufficient, substantially existent. Because I had always been taught that the self-sufficient, substantially existent person is something to be refuted, because without the appearance of the body and the mind, you don't have a person. But I'm not sure if I'm understanding it correctly, because I don't see what the difference between these two. I know you say one's gross, one's subtle, but what's the distinction?
I see. Yeah, there are numerous kinds of this. Like, so, let's see. One way of saying it is like, so, you just pointed out, right? Like, without the body and mind, they like, I guess I'll say this, like a permanent, unitary, independent self. Pause here. So, an example of that could be like, I was going to use an Indian example, but actually I'll use like a more typical example in American culture. Like, I can think of people I know, like, who would say, who they're like, they actually, in quite a, because they grew up in a certain cultural way, they would say very strongly, I have an eternal soul. And at the time of death, it will go to heaven and be there with my family. And that's because I have faith in God or something like that, right? Like, so, and that is, that was, it's, and they would say it's permanent, it was made by God, it's, it's my soul, it's not anybody else's, it's eternal, it will last forever, and so that would be an example of a permanent, unitary, independent self. And so you can say, like, that's an acquired belief, because the person, say, grew up in a certain church and they sort of learn that and they believe it quite deeply. And so that would be an example of a permanent, unitary, independent self. Whereas the self-sufficient, substantially existent self, as you said, right, is could be an example of that. Could be like, that's in terms of innate. What I'm getting at is this: is like, if somebody comes along and says, "I'm going to stab you," right? There's a feeling that arises in one's body, and mind, of like, that this I is going to be annihilated or is going to be harmed or something, right? And that seems to be there in the body and mind. And as you said, right, a proof of proof that it's not substantially existent and self-sufficient is that it doesn't appear without the body and mind. You're correct on that. But it's different in the sense that it's this it's not a view that it's not as what's the word? One isn't in that moment asserting that it's unitary or that it's eternal but there's this kind of feeling that it's self-sufficient and substantially existent right here, that when this person threatens me, and it exists in some substantial way right there, and that I'll defend it, or I'm afraid for it, or I want to defend it, I'll even harm the person for it. So that's the difference. So it's two different kinds of grasping at itself in a way. Those are examples. There are other ways of grasping it either. I gave one example of the permanent, unitary, independent one, and I gave a different. I mean, there are different ways they both appear, but that's an example of the difference. Does that get at your question though, or no?
Yeah, it does. I mean, so this second one, the self-sufficient, substantially existent self, would not necessarily be permanent. Would it? But it would be unitary.
That's an interesting question. Unitary. Isn't necessarily unitary. Oh, that's an interesting question because it doesn't tend to appear as multiple, does it? I mean, to us, I guess that's interesting. I guess maybe I'm not really sure. On the one hand, I think you're right that it doesn't appear as multiple, but I guess one point that sometimes they make is that with the permanent, independent, unitary one, there's some sense of it. Usually, there's a sense of it being independent of the body and mind. So something sort of like that's usually there in that one. Whereas on the self-sufficient, substantially existent one, Buddhist teachers sometimes point out that sometimes we grasp at it as being mind, like when we're feeling, and then sometimes we grasp it as body, as connected. So in one moment, like if somebody's going to stab me, then I'm identified with the body, and I feel they're going to stab me, meaning my body. At another moment, if I felt very despondent, in my emotions, my body feels fine, but my mind feels despondent. I would say, in this one, I would say I'm despondent, and I'm identifying that self-sufficient, substantially existent mind in that sense. And there are other moments where it's not clearly identified with either. So there's a sense of just I'm here, meaning my body and mind are here. I think that's what it's not as clearly unitary in that sense. I think that it can be identified in different moments in different ways. But I don't think that we identify it as multiple, and that I don't think happens. But I do think it changes how this self-sufficient, substantially existent one, we really do change in what sense we identify, and even with different aspects of our mind. So sometimes the person can be thinking, "Oh, I'm intelligent," another moment they feel I'm despondent, another moment they feel. So even within the mind, there can be different ways, different aspects of the mind that we then identify that self-sufficiency with. So. That's true, at least. I don't know if that,
Yeah, thank you. That does. It's hard because what is hard, I think, about all this is that we've been given the Prasankika view and to not cheat.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because and kind of jump up there. But to really appreciate what they are saying, because the fact is, when I examine my own beliefs and what I am actually grasping onto, the first tendency is to go to that Prasankika view. But if that's really being naughty,
yeah, no, you're right.
Yeah.
Well, and then Cynthia had something.
So maybe I don't know if it's related just from. So I'm similar to what Rai said. I'm always trying to compare or trying to understand between what I've learned with the Prasangika and this other tenets. So of course that introduces a lot of confusion. So just in this section of the valid cognizers, you mentioned one, like, is there just one difference, which is you mentioned the new, what was it?
Oh yeah, like in valid cognition, new
Yeah,
incontrovertible
so I'm
knowledge.
just wondering if the differences, if there's only one, the differences in definition would have one school say that the other school therefore will not. I'm just imagining that if they have very specific definitions of valid cognizer, how would they then disagree in terms of how that one school maybe will not get to the goal of enlightenment from their own perspective? Whereas when we went through the Lamrim, I know that what I got at that time was that Prasangika is just a lot more subtle. So I'm thinking of it as just a stepping stone in some ways, that in a way it's a largely consistent but not different. So I'm struggling with that, because I understand that these are all useful, but then if I apply some of this, will I end up being misdirected and then not end up in the right direction? I don't know if that's making sense.
Well, so I'll say something, and then you tell me if it fully answers your question or not. Okay, like maybe it was. I'll try to say something about what you said, and then see, like, I was going to say it the right way. Like, I'll say a couple things. Like, one is, like I said a few minutes ago, like, most of the points about, like, say, like the ways of knowing, right? These points about ways of knowing, or, like, so for example, wrong consciousness and doubt and correct assumption. Prasangika would agree with those points, for example, right? That beings have doubts, that beings have wrong consciousnesses, that beings have correct assumptions. Like a Prasangika, like Chandrakirti would say, yes, of course, all those things happen. And that's useful, so he wouldn't disagree with any of that, let's say, right? So there are many points in this that this school presents where a Prasangika would completely agree with them. So that's one point I'll make. But then I think you're raising another point, which is like, I'm trying to say this the right way, like, according to the Prasangika school, though, I'm going to say it the right way. Okay, so a few things. One is like, if you think of it from a Lamrim perspective, if you're meditating on, like, say, the low scope or the middle scope, as they're presented in Lamrim, I actually don't think the differences would come up much, really. There isn't much, there are differences in these schools, but actually they wouldn't really be, whereas like the low scope points of the nature of, taking refuge, of karma, they don't disagree on that. If you go into even, like, for example, that the Four Noble Truths are, and meditating on those, at least as they're presented in the Lamrim, it doesn't really, most Lamrim texts that I can think of don't differentiate yet, in that. So in that sense, there's a lot of overlap from a practice perspective. But then there is a point that's important, I think, that you're getting at, which is, according to the Prasangika school, everybody who's going to achieve liberation from samsara, whether you're going to become an arhat or a prajeka Buddha or a Buddha, has to realize the Prasangika view of emptiness. So from their perspective, this school's view of selflessness is not sufficient. While it's useful and better than grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, the Prasangikas would say it's not enough to achieve liberation. So in that sense, you're right. In other words, that this wouldn't be sufficient from a Prasangika perspective to realize the ultimate truth. They would say this is still not not the ultimate truth. And so a Prasangika would say, even arhats realize the Prasangika view of emptiness. So in that sense, there's a difference. And and on that point, these two schools would disagree. This school would say Prasangikas are nihilistic. Prasangikas would say this school still grasps, even when you realize their view of what's the ultimate truth, you're still grasping, you're still holding on to something that doesn't exist as if it exists. So they would say it's like there's still kind of a subtle ignorance there. And one other point I'll make, though, just for what it's worth, which is part of, I think, the Tibetan Tsongkhapa's sort of approach in a way, is that another benefit of studying this school, if you want to understand the Prasangika school, is that by studying these other tenet systems, it will help us to appreciate and understand the subtlety of the Prasangika's view. So in other words, from the perspective of somebody who's a Sautantrika, they would say, I'm just studying Sautantrika because this is the correct path, right? But from Tsongkhapa's perspective, and like if you read some of Tsongkhapa's texts or some of the texts of his followers, and even this text by Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen, in a way, what they're saying is studying these schools will help you refine your understanding so that when you get to the Prasangika's view, you'll be able to understand the subtle points of it. And without studying these schools, it's much harder to understand the subtlety of that view. So they say there's a metaphor that Tibetans use sometimes where they say it's like a steps that a person walks up, and that studying this. So it's two different things, though. From a Sautantrika's perspective, you study Sautantrika because it's the correct path. From a Prasangika's perspective, they would say, no, study Sautantrika. One is because they teach them useful things like these things about wrong consciousness and doubt, but also because their explanation of how things exist, when you get to studying the Prasangika, you'll understand it in a more refined way, because you'll have, if you look back and if you can say from a Prasangika perspective, exactly what's the mistake that a Sautantrika makes. And if you can't articulate it, then you don't understand the subtlety of the Prasangika view. If you can articulate that subtle distinction, then it'll really help you understand the Prasangika view more correctly. So that's in a way that's why in a way they study tenets in Tibet, is to be able to really get at what is so subtle about the Prasangika view. How is it? And I pointed this out, like sometimes what I was just thinking about this actually when after I taught it, I was in this class series, I was thinking about this one day. I was like going like, so what the Sautantrikas assert to be an ultimate truth, a Prasangika would assert to be the object of negation, right? And I was like really contemplating that and going, wow, like, okay, that really helped me a little bit understand in a different way what's the object of negation from a Prasangika view. It's so, because it's quite subtle. And so I'm just saying, so those are examples of why you study this, but you're right that it's different. And a Prasangika would say that's not sufficient. If you just realize that this school's view of a emptiness of a self-sufficient substantiation person, that's not sufficient. That's not enough to become liberated. And in the Lamrim, that's why Tsongkhapa or the other, Atisha and those different Lamrim authors present the Prasangika view in that section of the Lamrim, is at that point you really have to study that. But on the lower points in the Lamrim, there's much overlap in these different tenet systems. But did that fully answer your question, or is there more detail?
It helps me. I'm gonna think about it after. But would Prasangikas assert that Sautantrikas have a wrong view because of that?
Yeah.
Or is that strong wording in terms of those differences?
Yeah, there's actually, recently when the Dalai Lama was teaching, he made this point where he said, there's a line in, I don't remember what chapter, since the 6th chapter, I don't remember what verse or anything like that, but I think it's the 6th chapter, it might be the last chapter, 10th, I'm not sure which, but there's a point in Chandrakirti's Majjhimaka Avatara, Chandrakirti is the most definitive proponent, right? One of the greatest authors of the Prasangika school. And Dalai Lama points out that Chandrakirti makes this point in his text where after presenting the view of emptiness, he says, I'm not going to quote it exactly, but he basically says, even many of the great learned masters, and the Dalai Lama says he's referring to people like Vasubandhu, these great Buddhist masters who were followers of either the mind-only school or the Satantrika school, actually. And he says, even these great Buddhist masters, like that, and other ones like him, failed to understand this profound matter. Basically, he says, meaning the ultimate view of emptiness. So, Chandrakirti says, he respects them. He says they were great Buddhist masters, but when it comes to the view of emptiness, he says that because of their lack of imprints for this, they didn't quite understand it correctly. And there's even like a famous story that actually a Madhyamaka, but he was a Satantrika Madhyamaka, not a Prasangika. It was Baba Viveka, was one of the greatest Buddhist philosophers of all time, but he wasn't a Prasangika Madhyamaka. And Chandrakirti disagreed with him and debated with him and said he was wrong, and so on. And they actually say, though, it was an interesting point that I think gets at part of what you're getting at, underlying it maybe, is there's a famous story that Baba Viveka was this great Buddhist philosopher who was a follower of the Madhyamaka, but wasn't a Prasangika, and was a great master, actually. And they say when he died, he came back as another Pandit, who became Gantapa, who was the great Mahasiddha of the Chakrasamvara Tantra. And they say in that lifetime, he practiced, so in his lifetime as Baba Viveka, he achieved a certain level, but he didn't yet realize the Prasangika view. So he died and he came back as Gantapa. And that is the story they tell. And they say then he realized the Prasangika view while practicing the Chakrasamvara Tantra. And they say he became a Buddha in that lifetime, achieved full enlightenment. So it's like also that it was a process for him, like in other words, he was getting, obviously he was like somebody who over many lifetimes had practiced and wasn't yet a Prasangika in that life, but in the next life he realized the Prasangika view and became a Buddha. So I guess the point is that there really is this view in a way that these are almost like stairs or like steps that one can go through. And, sometimes, hopefully, if we can study them and there's a sense in which we can at least intellectually go through them in this life, but sometimes it goes over lifetimes even, is what they're in that example.
Thank you.
And then Lynn has
my sense of maybe Cynthia, maybe Varahi, what they were talking about is it's almost like, learning to ride a bike, you have training wheels, and there's a question whether the training wheels hurt you in the end from really learning to ride the bike. And it's sort of like, if we get stuck in this philosophy, or we really get deep into this, is that going to stop us from getting to the end of the road? I mean, that's sort of what I sense, because they're different. And so if we really, I don't know how to say it, maybe it's attachment, I don't know. But if we really get into this, is this going to hurt us in where we really want to go? That's the way I mean, I think that's Cynthia's struggle too. It's very different, and I understand it's a step, but it also has an ending or a goal.
Yeah.
And I can't get it to, it's hard not to get attached to the goal. It's like, I really want to understand this, but I can't get attached because it's only a step on the way to something else.
Really...
I like the analogy, because would it be limiting at some point? And how do you know? Yeah, that's a good analogy.
For floaties, when you're learning to swim.
It's interesting points, isn't it? Yeah. Huh. Yeah, and I get it. I guess like one thing that's making me think about it in a way, which I think is interesting, is like on the one hand, I really get it. Actually, I'll just share as you were saying that, I was thinking about a friend of mine who had a very dear friend who had done she had done a 3-year retreat of, I'm mentioning something tantric here, but she had done a 3-year retreat of Vajrayogini and then was a very good Vajrayogini practitioner, amazing, wonderful Vajrayogini practitioner. And then like I was there actually, one of her lamas suggested that she do another 3-year retreat of Yamantaka. And she followed her lama's advice. And then she said, she spent years though, like going like, but I want to be doing Vajrayogini. You know, it was like, I want to go back to, and like, you know, but it took her 4 years, I think, to do it. It wasn't 3 years, it was 4 years or something, you know, and like, where she didn't have much time to do her the thing that the practice she had gotten so love. And I often thought about that afterwards. I was like, wow, that was really interesting advice. Like, because I think she had a similar feeling is what I'm getting at. It was this feeling of like, but this is my main highway to enlightenment. And why am I doing this other? It's like, it felt like going away to something else. And I get it in a way. And say it the right way. Like on the one hand, I'm going to give a complicated answer, just my own reflection, which is, on the one hand, you could say, well, all the great, you know, like all the great masters of, or not all, almost all the great, most of the great masters of Tibet studied all the tenet systems. You know, most of the great Buddhist masters of India, like Chandrakirti, studied all the tenet systems. You know, like, and you can tell because they debated with, you know, like Chandrakirti often in his writings, he was the greatest writer, author of Prasangika philosophy, but he brings up points from these other tenet systems in order to debate them. So, you know, he was a great scholar of those and so on. You know, so, you know, whether you think of Tibetan masters or Indian masters, they studied those points and it was helpful to them in understanding the Prasangika, as I was mentioning. On the other hand, though, I get it in a way, like, you know, because in other words, for an individual person, like it has to be the right, you know, I guess we have to say for, you know, so like in general, it's important to study. In general, it can help. Studying these other tenet systems can help you understand Prasangika's view. But that's different than from the individual's perspective, right? For any given individual, I think it's a fair question. Like, in other words, is it helping me? And will it help me? That's a different question, you know. And in what sense might it help me? Or what sense might it make me more, you know, make things harder for me? And, you know, my friend about, this was different, it wasn't about emptiness, but it was about practice. You know, I think she sat with that question for years, you know, sort of, wow, I want to go back to my other practice. And whatever. I think in the end, both, you know, I think the conclusion was in the end, it really helped her to be a better Vajrayogini practitioner that she did the other retreat, you know, like when, you know, now years later, it's very clear, I think, that she's a better practitioner of that practice because she did the other one. But I think it took her maybe a decade to, I'm not sure, but my guess is that it may have taken her a decade to come to the clarity about that. So I think it's an individual sort of, in one way, I think it's a very individual question of like, wow, how is this helping me or not helping me? And will it help me understand that? But I will say one last point, which is like, you know, I guess I'll say a few things. Like one is, like I've said this at the very beginning of the series of classes, is, you know, you know, it's funny with the Madhyamaka, like Prasangika Madhyamaka. I was thinking about this just yesterday, actually. Like if you want to just study it in a very, I don't know what the word is, there are like these very brief practice instructions, right? Like, you know, if you look in like, say, the Easy Path, which I edited, right, by Khyentse Rinpoche, there's a very brief, sort of very clear, wonderful, Khyentse Rinpoche's teaching on it is very clear and wonderful, but it's extremely brief, actually. You know, it's like, this is how you meditate on Prasangika's view. It's very short. There's the instruction, right? Like, you don't have to know mind-only school or Sartantrika school or Rabashka school to follow that, right? But also, as I think about it, it's also not so easy from that instruction. If you only read that instruction, and in terms of coming to a valid cognition, if later somebody presents to you, we'll do it. Actually, when we get to, the next section is going to be the mind-only school, right? That's what we're going to cover next. If you want to come to that, I want to point something out, which is like, there will be a point when when we're going through the mind-only school where I'll present the mind-only school. Maybe even at the beginning I'll present a part of it. I don't know. Anyway, my point is like, if you can't tell the difference between that and the Prasangika view, between the, I mean, in general, you can, there's a way of presenting the mind only school where it's like, you can see, it's like your glaring differences. They're extremely seem different, right? You say everything is only mind or so, or whatever. It's not, that's not actually mind only school. You know, there's a way of presenting it where it seems very simplistic to see the difference. But maybe I'll actually find it. There are some quotes. If you look at like some quotes really from the mind only philosophy, I think it'll actually be quite challenging to say, how is that, if I ask you, how is that different from the Prasangika view, it'll be quite challenging to find the difference. And yet, according to Chandrakirti, if you can't see the difference, then you don't understand the Prasangika view and you're not going to achieve liberation. So you see, when you get into that level of subtlety, then it becomes very important, doesn't it? Like, whereas, because if you can't tell the difference, then you don't know the difference, and then you're not really meditating. You're meditating on something that's not quite the Prasangika view in terms of subtlety. You know, if you can't see the difference or cognize the difference. And so all I'm pointing out is that there comes a point where it's very useful, or it becomes like very important to be able to tell those differences. And if you want, that's what I was getting at. If you go to a brief text, then it's not clear what that is. But if you start to read like Shantideva's chapter on, actually, if you read Shantideva's chapter on emptiness and the guides of Bodhisattva's way of life, you can't understand it if you haven't studied the other tenet systems. Or if you study chapter 6 of Chandrakirti's Majjhimaka Avatara, you can't understand it if you haven't studied the other tenet systems, because much of what he's presenting is differentiating these subtle distinctions. And so again, I think it's a very practice question. In other words, if somebody's taking a very brief Lam Rim text and just going off to retreat, and that's their focus for them, then maybe they don't need to study all these other things for that time, for that purpose. But if you want to, what's the word, have like a broader, you know, like the Dalai Lama sometimes says, in the end, it's not enough. You have to study more broadly about Majjhimaka and Prasangika to really gain a deeper insight into it. But of course, that's individual. You know, there might be some people who studied it so much in a past life that just hearing one word, they realize, you know, there's stories like that, right? So it is partly individual to the person. But in a general way, if you want to study the Prasangika view in detail, it's quite difficult to do, because even Shantideva's text, again, it's really like, he has this whole section on self-knowers, right? Where he's refuting self-knowers. But if you don't know what a self-knower is, you don't know what he's talking about. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and that's Shantideva. He's a very practice-oriented text, right? The Guides of the Bodhisattva's Way of Life is very focused on practice. But, and he has a section where he's talking about mind-only school views and Sautantrika views as he's presenting the Prasangika view. So I guess my point is just, if you want to actually study those teachings in order to meditate on them, then you have to study these things enough so that you know what they're talking about and what they're refuting, and why they're drawing these subtle distinctions. But anyway, but you know, but I want to respect also, there are sometimes times where it's like the wrong moment to study, you know, so I get that too. There can be times where a person says, you know, right now it's not the right time for me to study a certain topic. That's fair, I think, and that's reasonable also. So I'm just trying to present, you know, yeah, both positions. You know. Oh, I'm realizing we went way over, so we should stop. But anyway, next class is I think July 10th or something like that. And then I realized that I didn't schedule anything past that, so I will send Gabe. Yeah, July 10th is the next class, so that's scheduled. And that will start on the Mind Only School, which is a Mahayana school, right? The first of the two Mahayana schools. And I will send, before then, for sure, I'll send Gabe a list of classes for July, August, and maybe into September or something. At least July and August, maybe September also. But anyway, we should do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, made arise and grow, but has arisen and not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you all. Have a good couple weeks.